Thank you, Rupert. The question comes, what are we doing here?
You tell me. Why did you come?
Well, that's.
Is that what you meant? Why did we come here?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, that's a good question, but I can't know why you came here.
Yes.
You presumably know why you came here.
I'm hoping to find out with this conversation now, and what I was really taken by your saying that it's only awareness that can be aware of itself.
It's only awareness that is aware.
Yes.
Or awareness is the name we give to that which is aware.
Yes, and that's the I.
And the name that anything gives to itself is I. Yes? You call yourself I.
Yes.
If a dog could speak, it would call itself I. If a tree could speak, it would refer to itself as I. If a flower could know itself, it would refer to itself as I. If a glass could know itself, it would refer to itself as I. So I is the name that anything that knows itself gives to itself. So the question is, what is it that knows itself? What is it that is aware of itself? Now, whatever it is that is aware of itself must have one quality. It must be aware.
Yeah.
That which is aware is what we call awareness. So I is the name that the mind gives to awareness's knowledge of itself.
And then there's the veiling that you said was also awareness, right?
Yes, because all experience, thinking, feeling, sensing,
Yes.
perceiving, all experience is the activity of consciousness. In the same way that a movie could be said to be the activity of the screen. So it's true that thus far I've only referred to the objects appearing in awareness or in consciousness, like people appearing in the space of a room. And that's true, but awareness is not just that which knows our experience. It is not just that in which our experience arises. It is also that out of which our experience is made, or of which our experience is the activity.
Even the activity of resisting that awareness.
Take the activity of resistance. Evoke now in you the feeling of resistance, whether it's physical, emotional, psychological, or whatever. Is there anything to that experience other than the knowing of it?
As a thought.
Whether it's thinking, feeling, sensation,
Yeah.
perception. In fact, is there anything to any experience other than the knowing of it? That's a question for you.
Yes.
Is there anything to your experience? A yes or no question. Is there anything to your experience other than the knowing of it?
Just the knowing of it.
Just the knowing or the consciousness of it.
Yeah.
In other words, if you touch any experience, thinking, imagining, feeling, remembering, sensing, seeing, hearing, touching, touch any experience, touch the stuff any experience is made of. Is there anything there apart from consciousness or knowing?
Just the knowing.
Not even the knowing of it.
Just the knowing.
As if experience were one thing and the knowing of it another thing. That all there is to experience is knowing. Has anyone here ever known anything other than knowing? Or imagine all 7 billion of us, not just those of us interested in these matters, but have any of the 7 billion of us, could any of the 7 billion of us ever know anything other than knowing? And when I say the 7 billion of us, I don't mean that we are one thing and knowing is something else
Yeah.
that we know. We are knowing, we are consciousness, we are awareness. I use the words knowing, consciousness, and awareness synonymously. We are that which knows. We are this knowing presence. And this knowing presence never knows anything other than itself. Knowing, knowing only, knowing.
Yes.
Even think of God, whatever you imagine God to be. Could God ever know anything other than the knowing of its experience? In other words, for God, could any other substance be present other than knowing? The answer must be no.
Has to be only knowing.
Because if you were to say yes, for God, there is something apart from knowing, how would God know that something without knowing it? And what would its experience of that something be? Just the knowing of it.
Come on, God, do you think you can know something you didn't know?
That's what God is, pure knowing, pure consciousness.
Yeah.
It's the only stuff there is. And this is not abstract, non-dual philosophy. I'm just talking about our experience. Has anyone here ever experienced anything other than knowing? When I say anyone here, I seem to talk to people. I'm speaking to knowing. Have you, knowing, ever known anything other than knowing? There are no people here. There are no objects here.
Only knowing here.
Only knowing. And this is not some highfalutin philosophy. What is a highfalutin philosophy? Is the belief that there are separate selves and people and objects made out of matter. That is abstract philosophy. That is convoluted, metaphysical, abstract philosophy.
So when I heard you say the veiling of...
that there is consciousness and its own activity. That's it.
That's it.
That's it. Consciousness veils itself with its own activity. Consciousnness assumes the form of thinking, imagining, feeling, sensing, perceiving, and colours itself with its own activity, in the same way that a screen colours itself with its own activity and appears as a landscape. But it never actually ceases to be the screen. Well, consciousness is not like this is not a screen that is being watched by someone sitting on a sofa. It's a magical screen, an aware screen. Imagine a TV screen that is infinitely large. In fact, it has no dimensions, but imagine that it is infinitely large and that it has the ability to watch the movie that is playing on it. Consciousness is like that. Consciousness is a dimensionless field of pure knowing which assumes the activity of thinking, feeling, sensing and perceiving, and in doing so colours itself with its own activity and appears to be something other than itself, called the world. Yeah. So the world is the activity of consciousness.
So I think that's what I was thinking when Robert answered. It was because maybe that's the time when I think awareness disappears, when I'm into that.
Well, if awareness would anything that disappears, anything that appears or disappears must appear or disappear in something or on something. Yeah? You cannot have a cloud without a sky, or an email without a screen, or the words of a novel without a page, or a wave without an ocean. Yeah? And whatever appears emerges out of its background. So the cloud emerges out of the sky and goes back into the sky. The email on the screen emerges from the screen and dissolves into the screen. The wave on the ocean arises out of the ocean and dissolves back into the ocean. In each case, the appearance is temporary, but the reality, the sky, the screen, the ocean, is, relatively speaking, permanent. So if consciousness were to disappear, it would have to also appear. So if consciousness were to appear and disappear, ask yourself, in what medium would consciousness appear? Out of what background would consciousness emerge? There would have to be something. If consciousness were an appearance, two things. One, it would have to have a limit.
Yes.
It would have to be a form, because everything that appears by definition has a form. So consciousness would have to have a form.
Yeah.
And if we go to the experience of being aware, we don't find any form there. So to suggest that consciousness has a form is already contrary to our experience. But let's say it had a form. Only something that has a form can emerge or appear. In what medium would this, and having a form, it would be limited. In what medium would this limited awareness appear? What is your experience? Can you go further back in your experience to find a medium within which awareness appears and then disappears? Can you find that?
No.
Can anyone here find a medium in their experience in which awareness appears and disappears? No, it's not possible.
Then how does that relate to form is formless and formless is form?
Because the ocean has in the analogy. Let's take the screen. The aware screen is transparent, empty. It has no form. It colours itself in the form of the landscape, and the landscape has a form: trees, fields, flowers, rocks. So, but what is the stuff that the form of the landscape is made of? Yes. It is made out of the only stuff there is the screen. Formless. And the screen has no form. It is the formless that appears as a form, but never becomes a form. The screen never becomes a landscape. It appears. So it is the formless reality of the screen that appears in the form of the landscape. But if we touch the landscape, the apparent forms, we actually don't find any limitations there. If we go to the screen, we find the unlimited screen. Now, it's the same thing in our experience. Our experience seems to comprise a multiplicity and diversity of objects and selves, each of which are limited, each of which have a form. But if we touch our experience, what is the stuff experience is made of? We only find knowing. And there is nothing in knowing other than knowing with which knowing could be limited. Knowing could only be limited by something if something was introduced. If you introduced a wall in this space, the wall would be something other than the space, and it would divide the space. But you couldn't make a wall out of space. You couldn't divide this room with a wall made out of space. The space cannot be divided by space, yes? It has to be divided by something other than space. So only something other than knowing could divide knowing into a multiplicity and diversity of objects. But what is there in experience other than knowing? Has anyone here ever found anything other than knowing in experience? There is nothing. If we just proceed like honest scientists and we stick scrupulously to the evidence of experience, all we can say is there is knowing. And there is nothing in knowing other than knowing, with which knowing could be divided into a multiplicity and diversity of discrete objects and selves.
The mind does that.
It is this knowing that assumes the form of thinking. And in the form of thinking, the mind can say there are people, there are objects, there are things, there is a multiplicity, there are 10,000 things. So that thinking, the belief there are 10,000 things, there are separate selves, is still made out of this formless knowing. In other words, there is no real ignorance. That is why in India they don't refer to ignorance, they refer to the illusion of ignorance. There is no real veiling of knowing, because with what would knowing be veiled?
Its own knowing.
When you're watching a movie, the screen seems to be veiled by the landscape. And for one who believes the screen is veiled by the landscape, we might as a first step say No, understand that the screen is behind the landscape. This would suggest that the landscape is one thing in the front, and the screen is another thing that is veiled by it in the background. But the screen is not veiled by the landscape, because all there is to the landscape is the screen. There is nothing on the screen other than the screen with which the screen could be veiled. Even if the screen appears as a black image, the darkest possible image, the screen is shining in and as that image. Likewise, take the equivalent experience. Even in the deepest depression, the darkest depression, one might say in the early stages of this investigation that one's innate being, pure consciousness or pure knowing, is veiled by the darkness of the depression. But no, if you touch the stuff your depression is made of, all that is there is knowing. Yeah. Knowing is shining as this dark feeling. The dark feeling doesn't veil consciousness. There is nothing in consciousness other than consciousness with which consciousness could be veiled or divided. Consciousness veils itself with itself, which is no real veiling. There is no real veiling. The whole idea that consciousness is veiled or hidden behind the world is a concession, a legitimate concession to the belief that there are objects and selves. In relation to that belief, the teaching says, okay, take a step back. See that behind your experience there is this ever-present screen of awareness. That's just a step. It's the first step. Sooner or later we have to collapse the distinction between awareness and its objects.
Yes.
In the ultimate analysis, there are no objects of awareness. There are no objects or selves, period. There is just one infinite, intimate, indivisible whole. And having nothing in itself other than itself, it cannot be disturbed. What would disturb it? Space cannot be disturbed by space, and thus its nature is peace. And having nothing in itself other than itself, it never has the feeling of lacking anything, because what would the thing be that it lacked? It cannot lack itself, and thus its nature is happiness.
That's why I'm not disturbed by what happens then.
And it's from this understanding,
yes.
This is what Krishnamurti said when he said,
that's
my great secret is that I don't mind what happens.
Yeah. Is to live from that place.
Yes, to understand this. And when I say understanding, I never, when I use the word understanding, I never refer to conceptual knowledge.
Yeah.
I mean experiential understanding, to know this for oneself, in one's own experience. Yeah. And for most of us, to begin with, we have a taste of this, yes. And then the old thoughts and feelings eclipse this understanding. So we go back to it. We take another pathway. The path. This conversation has just been one pathway. There are numerous pathways. We take another pathway back to this understanding. And each time we take the pathway back to this understanding, the pathway gets shorter. It doesn't take 45 minutes, it takes 5 minutes. And it doesn't take 5 minutes, it takes a minute. The pathway gets shorter. And we begin to be... We don't just visit this understanding from time to time. It becomes our lived and felt experience.
That's what I came for.
Okay.
That's it. That's it. Thank you.
Well, I hope you get what you came for. You are already what you came for, but I hope that becomes increasingly clear to you over the week.
Yes. Thank you very much.